The word sliced through the humid air of the training hangar at Fort Bragg like a serrated blade. Commander Rick Jensen, a monument to arrogance in human form, had just backhanded a soldier across the face. Not to knock her out, but to humiliate her. The crowd of elite warriors flinched, waiting for tears or apologies. But the woman didn't move. At 65 years old, Commander Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still, absorbing the violence like armor absorbs bullets. Her silver hair gleamed under the harsh lights. Her weathered face remained calm. And on the observation catwalk above, General Marcus Thorne leaned forward, his blood running cold. He recognized that stance, that impossible stillness. Jensen had just made the gravest mistake of his decorated career. He'd mistaken age for weakness and silence for surrender. The training hangar at Fort Bragg was a cathedral of military might, its vaulted ceilings echoing with the sounds of America's finest warriors preparing for war. Today, it hosted a joint demonstration on close-quarters combat techniques, bringing together Green Berets, Rangers, Air Force pararescuemen, and a visiting contingent of Navy SEALs. At the center of the mat stood Commander Rick Jensen, 38 years old, built like a Greek statue and possessing an ego to match. The golden trident pin to his chest caught the light as he gestured dramatically to the assembled crowd. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced boom of someone who loved the sound of his own authority, "what you're about to witness is the difference between theory and reality, between reading about combat in a manual and actually living it in the field." He turned to scan the crowd, his eyes landing on a figure standing quietly at the edge of the demonstration area. "I need a volunteer for this demonstration. Someone to show these techniques on." His gaze fixed on the older woman in naval dress uniform, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her posture military perfect despite her age. "Commander Mitchell," Jensen called out, his tone dripping with theatrical courtesy that barely masked his condescension. "Would you do us the honor?" Commander Sarah Mitchell, 65 years old and carrying more than 4 decades of military service, stepped forward without hesitation. Her movements were economical, efficient, the product of a lifetime of discipline. The crow's feet around her eyes spoke of years squinting into hostile suns. The slight limp in her left leg whispered of old injuries that never quite healed. Jensen's smile widened. He had chosen her deliberately, a setup designed to showcase his dominance. An older female officer, past her prime, wearing a desk uniform, the perfect foil to demonstrate his superiority. "Commander Mitchell here represents our administrative and support services," Jensen announced to the crowd, completely inventing her role. "Essential to our operations, of course, but not quite the same as those of us who've been downrange, in the thick of it." Sarah said nothing. She simply positioned herself on the mat as directed, her hands at her sides, her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that silence was the most powerful response to arrogance. Jensen circled her like a predator sizing up prey. "Now, in a real-world scenario, you might face an opponent who doesn't look threatening. Someone older, smaller, apparently weaker." He reached out suddenly and grabbed her shoulder, not roughly, but with clear intent to control. The key is not to underestimate. The world exploded into motion. What happened next occurred in less than 3 seconds, but to those watching, it seemed to unfold in a dreamlike sequence of impossible grace and devastating efficiency. Sarah's hand, which had been hanging relaxed at her side, moved with the speed of a striking cobra. It wrapped around Jensen's wrist, her fingers finding pressure points with surgical precision. His grip on her shoulder vanished as white-hot pain shot through his arm. Before he could react, she pivoted, a movement so subtle it barely disturbed the air, and used his own forward momentum against him. Her other hand struck his elbow joint at exactly the right angle, not to break it, but to completely compromise his structure. Jensen, all 220 pounds of elite warrior, found himself suddenly impossibly off balance. Sarah guided his fall with such perfect control that it looked almost gentle, like a dance move rather than a combat technique. His knees hit the mat hard, followed by his torso. In the final, devastating movement, Sarah maintained her grip on his wrist and rotated it into a lock that had him completely immobilized. His face was pressed against the training mat, his arm bent at an angle that promised agony if he resisted. The entire sequence had been a masterclass in the principle that technique trumps strength, that experience outweighs youth, and that the most dangerous warriors are often the quietest ones. The hanger fell into a silence, so profound it felt like a physical presence. Sarah held the lock for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make her point, not long enough to humiliate unnecessarily. Then she released him and stepped back, her breathing unchanged, her expression still neutral. Jensen pushed himself up, his face a mixture of shock, pain, and dawning humiliation. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. From the observation catwalk, a slow, deliberate clapping began. General Marcus Thorne descended the stairs, his applause echoing through the hangar like gunshots. "Gentlemen," the general announced as he reached the mat, "you have just witnessed a demonstration by one of the finest warriors in the United States military." He turned to Jensen. "Commander, do you know who you just tried to demonstrate on?" Jensen, still on one knee, shook his head mutely. "This is Commander Sarah Mitchell," Thorne continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the hangar. 43 years of service, 6 combat deployments spanning 3 different conflicts. Before she was a Navy SEAL, and yes, Commander Jensen, she is a SEAL. She was Marine Force Recon. She was part of the first female cohort to integrate into special operations, back when people like you said it couldn't be done. The general's eyes swept the crowd. Commander Mitchell holds a master instructor certification in 7 different martial arts systems. She has personally trained 3 generations of special operators. She has more combat experience than everyone in this room combined. He turned back to Jensen. "And she was gracious enough to volunteer for your little demonstration, knowing full well what you intended. She gave you every opportunity to be professional. Instead, you chose arrogance." The weight of the general's words settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Sarah finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Permission to address the group, General?" "Granted." She turned to face the assembled warriors, her weathered face softening slightly. "What just happened here is a lesson you all need to learn. Not about combat techniques, though there's that too, but about assumptions." She gestured to herself. "You look at me and see gray hair, age lines, a woman past her prime." Commander Jensen saw an easy mark, a prop for his demonstration. She paused. "He's not alone in that. We all make snap judgments based on surface appearances." Sarah began to pace slowly, her slight limp more pronounced now, but her bearing still commanding. In the field, those assumptions can get you killed. The elderly man walking toward your checkpoint might be carrying enough explosives to level a building. The teenager who looks harmless might have more combat experience than you'll ever accumulate. She stopped in front of a young Green Beret who looked barely old enough to shave. "You've been judged today too, haven't you? People see your baby face and assume you're not capable. But I've read your file. You're one of the top graduates from your Q course. Your instructors say you're a natural." The young soldier's eyes widened in surprise. "My point," Sarah continued, addressing the entire group again, "is that real warriors don't waste energy proving how tough they are. They don't need to announce their credentials or belittle others to feel strong. They simply are, quietly, competently, professionally." She turned to Jensen, who had finally gotten to his feet. "Commander, you're a good operator. Your record shows that. But your need to be the loudest, most dominant person in every room is a weakness, not a strength. It blinds you. It makes you sloppy. And one day, it will get someone killed." Jensen's face had gone from red to pale. He managed a nod, unable to meet her eyes. General Thorne stepped forward again. "The training session is over. Everyone dismissed except Commander Jensen. You will remain here." The operators filed out, their usual swagger replaced by a contemplative silence. As they passed Commander Mitchell, more than a few offered respectful nods, which he returned with quiet dignity. In the weeks that followed, the story spread through the special operations community like wildfire. It was told in mess halls and briefing rooms, in barracks and on training ranges. With each retelling, it gathered embellishments, but the core truth remained. The quiet 65-year-old woman had dismantled the arrogant SEAL commander in 3 seconds. Commander Jensen received a formal reprimand and was reassigned to training duties, not as a lead instructor, but as an assistant. His commanding officer made it clear he would rebuild his career from the ground up with humility as his foundation, or he would leave the service entirely. To Jensen's credit, he chose to rebuild. He sought out Commander Mitchell weeks later, finding her in the base library, reading a technical manual on modern warfare doctrine. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened in that hangar." Sarah looked up, marking her page. "Go on." "I've spent my entire career believing that being the toughest, the loudest, the most aggressive was what made me a good SEAL. You showed me that real strength is quiet. Real competence doesn't need to announce itself." He paused, struggling with the words. "I have a daughter. She's thinking about military service. Until that day, I would have tried to talk her out of it. I didn't think women belonged in combat roles, no matter what the policy said. And now," Sarah asked, "now I'm going to tell her about you, about the most professional warrior I've ever encountered, who happens to be a 65-year-old woman who taught me the hardest lesson of my life." He met her eyes. "Thank you, ma'am." Sarah nodded slowly. "Commander, we all have lessons to learn. The warriors who survive, who truly excel, are the ones who remain humble enough to keep learning. You took your lesson. That takes more courage than most people have." Commander Sarah Mitchell retired 6 months later at a small ceremony attended only by close colleagues. There were no speeches about her legendary takedown, no public recognition of the lessons she taught. She slipped into civilian life the same way she'd moved through her military career, quietly, efficiently, without fanfare. But her legacy lived on. At Fort Bragg, a new training module was added to the Special Operations curriculum. It was called Cognitive Bias and Threat Assessment, but everyone knew it as the Mitchell Protocol. Operators were taught to question their assumptions, to look beyond surface appearances, to respect experience over appearance. Commander Jensen became one of the program's most effective instructors, using his own failure as a teaching tool. He would tell the story honestly, sparing no detail of his arrogance or his comeuppance. "I thought her age made her weak," he would say to each new class. "I thought my youth and strength made me superior. I was catastrophically wrong on both counts. The mission doesn't care about your ego. The enemy doesn't care about your assumptions. All that matters is competence, preparation, and the humility to respect every person you encounter." Years later, a young female SEAL candidate struggling through the brutal training pipeline received an unexpected letter of encouragement. It was from Commander Sarah Mitchell, retired, who had somehow heard about her struggles and wanted her to know, "The voices that say you don't belong are the same voices that said I didn't belong 40 years ago. They were wrong then. They're wrong now. Be quiet. Be competent. Be professional. And when the moment comes, be devastating." That young woman kept the letter in her locker through every phase of training. She would eventually become one of the most decorated operators in SEAL history, and she would pass the same lesson down to the next generation. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply is. Moral of the story: true strength is not found in the volume of one's voice or the swagger of one's step, but in quiet competence, humility, and respect for others regardless of their appearance, age, or rank. The most dangerous person in any room is rarely the one who advertises their power. They are the observer, the listener, the one who has nothing to prove because their skills speak for themselves. Assumptions based on surface judgments are not just disrespectful. They are dangerous tactical vulnerabilities. Real warriors don't need to dominate conversations or belittle others to feel strong. They lead through example, teach through patience, and command respect through their actions, not their arrogance. In the end, legacy is not the noise you make in the world, but the wisdom you leave behind in the hearts and minds of those who witnessed your quiet excellence. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that true strength lies in quiet competence and that the most powerful warriors are often the most humble, then subscribe to USX Stories. We bring you real tales of courage, professionalism, and the triumph of skill over ego. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that values substance over swagger and competence over arrogance. Because the best stories aren't always the loudest. They're the ones that change how we see the world. At Fort Bragg, a new training module was added to the Special Operations curriculum. It was called Cognitive Bias and Threat Assessment, but everyone knew it as the Mitchell Protocol. Operators were taught to question their assumptions, to look beyond surface appearances, to respect experience over appearance. Commander Jensen became one of the program's most effective instructors, using his own failure as a teaching tool. He would tell the story honestly, sparing no detail of his arrogance or his comeuppance. "I thought her age made her weak," he would say to each new class. "I thought my youth and strength made me superior. I was catastrophically wrong on both counts." The mission doesn't care about your ego. The enemy doesn't care about your assumptions. All that matters is competence, preparation, and the humility to respect every person you encounter. Years later, a young female SEAL candidate struggling through the brutal training pipeline received an unexpected letter of encouragement. It was from Commander Sarah Mitchell, retired, who had somehow heard about her struggles and wanted her to know. The voices that say you don't belong are the same voices that said I didn't belong 40 years ago. They were wrong then. They're wrong now. Be quiet. Be competent. Be professional. And when the moment comes, be devastating. That young woman kept the letter in her locker through every phase of training. She would eventually become one of the most decorated operators in SEAL history, and she would pass the same lesson down to the next generation. Real strength doesn't announce itself. It simply is.